Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Julius from Modern Health. We'll be giving a couple of more minutes for everyone to trickle in, and super excited to launch this in just 2 minutes.
Julius, I'm curious how globally diverse our group will be today. Where are you joining from?
Well, I'm joining from far away, Lithuania, Europe.
Very nice. I'm in sunny North Carolina on the East Coast of the US.
And I am on Cape Cod right now, in Massachusetts. Yeah.
Cape Cod. It's a beautiful national seashore. That's a good place to be.
Yeah, not too bad.
Julius, are you following Euro?
I'm definitely following Euro. I have to skip a few games, but England won yesterday, where I spent 3 years of my life. So I'm excited for a lot of my friends in England. Sad for German friends, though, who lost. But everyone who is joining, feel free to drop where you're joining from in the chat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Always fun to see how wide the network is.
Darren, are you a football, soccer fan?
I enjoy watching it. It's obviously not the #1 sport that's publicized in the United States, but kudos to ESPN, our local broadcaster here, for covering all of the Euro games. It makes it easy to follow along. Nice. It almost feels like a World Cup, but for Europe, and that's probably what it is, and it shows my American ignorance to what it actually is, but it's fun. Still, it's got very much got that World Cup energy, but in a smaller region.
Cool, and we are 2 minutes past, so I think we are ready to start, and then more people will be joining soon. But I'm Julius. I'm here for the logistical reasons. I'll be monitoring the Q&A box of Zoom, where you can post questions for Darren and Alyson. And I'm super excited to introduce Alyson, the founder and CEO of Modern Health. Alyson, take it away.
Hey, everyone. Super excited to be here. Thanks, Julius. And thanks, everyone, for joining us ahead of a July 4th weekend. Super excited about this topic, given how relevant it is with everything going on today and the world we're living in today. And very excited to introduce Darren, who has been named an Oracle of Remote Work by CNBC. Darren serves as GitLab's head of remote, a visionary in organizational design. He works at the intersection of culture, operations, people, talent, branding, marketing, and communication. He spent his career leading remote teams and charting remote transformations, which I'm very excited to learn more about. He holds a Guinness World Record in publishing and authored GitLab's Remote Playbook and Living the Remote Dream, a guide to seeing the world, setting records, and advancing your career. Darren has pioneered the head of remote role, interviewed by CNBC, CNN, The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, Fortune, Business Insider, to name a few. Darren, very excited to have you. Let you give a quick hello to everyone, and then we can jump into some questions that I'm sure everyone's eager to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alyson. And now I can add Modern Health to that list. So I'm excited to jump in and join today. This is an amazing intersection, the nexus of health, mental health, modern health, and remote work, and where we're going forward. So I'm excited for the conversation. Let's go.
Awesome. And for all of those who are listening in, feel free to add any questions to the chat. We want this to be as interactive as it possibly can be, but really this is for you. So please, add questions and we'll try to address as many of them as we can. So to kick off, Darren, would love to hear, as a leader, where does creating psychologically safe atmosphere start? What are the responsibilities of leadership, and how can they support a psychologically safe environment? Would love to hear, from your experience, what you've seen to work well or not work well.
Yeah, so I'll give you some context before diving into this answer. So I'm currently at GitLab. We're a collaboration and DevOps platform. We have 1,300 people in more than 65 countries with no company-owned offices. So the company was built to operate in an all-remote fashion, which is a fascinating organizational design. There's an article in the Journal of Organizational Design that tries to wrap its mind around how we've constructed this. But most of my career has been spent in a different place along the spectrum of remote, in a hybrid scenario. And of course, hybrid looks different depending on who you ask. But the point of bringing all of that to light is it's very complex, but there are some things that are uniform throughout. A lot of people look at GitLab and they say, oh, GitLab's all remote. So what they're doing in the field of remote work doesn't apply to us because we have real estate. But that's not true. Most of what we've found are proven principles. All remote makes you do things that your business should be doing anyway. We just have to do it much earlier and with much more intentionality because we don't have the office as a crutch. That includes creating a psychologically safe atmosphere. It unequivocally starts with leadership. If you don't see psychological safety being honored at the highest level of the organization, it cannot be administered bottoms up. It absolutely has to be top down. The other thing I would offer here is this cannot be something that is administered on a manager to manager or leader to leader basis. This really has to be written into the core of the company, because as people shift managers, they shift teams, they advance in their career, one thing that has to be uniform is the notion of psychological safety. So here's how we do this at GitLab. We write it into our company values. We have 6 core values, but we have a lot of substantiating values. These are the operating principles of how things like collaboration and iteration are actually lived out. And I'll give you 2 examples. One is short toes. So we tell people that anyone at GitLab can contribute to anyone else's domain without fear of stepping on their toes, because we expect you to collaborate with short toes. Another one is low level of shame. So we explicitly say that we want people to share things early and in draft, not fully thought out, with a low level of shame. And the reason for doing that is we want people to get things out there early to get the most feedback from the most people, so that you don't go too far down a path that could have been corrected if you had just shared it with someone earlier on. These are things that most companies would say are tacit or implied knowledge. This is the vibe of the office, the cultural unspoken rules of how work gets done. But in a remote setting, you can't do that. And I would argue it's more inclusive to convert what is tacit to explicit, so that it's documented, it's written down, and can be easily shared with the organization and get buy-in around it. So that's a boring solution, but write down what psychological safety means to you and try to weave it into the fabric of your company values.
Super, super helpful. Thanks for sharing. And, very similar to the way that we approach psychological safety at Modern Health. I think one of the other things that we embody that helps create a psychologically safe environment is, one of our values is embrace the journey. And really, that's just having an open mind to different perspectives, to really whatever comes our way. And we take a rule from improv, which is called yes and. So instead of, a scene dies in improv when someone says no, right? You kind of give something on stage, and if you say no, kind of the air is let out of the room. And so we very much take an approach that we can disagree, and actually we encourage healthy debate, but let's approach things with yes and here's my perspective, and here's from where I sit, how I'm thinking about this, and have those healthy debates. So I think for us, embracing the journey with yes and is one of the ways that we create a psychologically safe environment. There's no dumb question, there's no dumb answer. Like, let's all create an environment where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas, and also leading with vulnerability. Knowing that it's okay to not be perfect. No one is perfect, and to show up and be human and be authentic, and lead with that empathy with those around us, knowing that everyone is going through different things in their lives, and ultimately, whatever they're going through is valid, and we should support that and understand that, and show up with leading with empathy to ultimately create that psychologically safe environment. And so those are some of the tenets that we've embodied at Modern Health, which I think has really helped us in our approach and pursuit to create that type of safe environment. So moving on to our next question, Darren, I'd love to learn about proximity bias. This is new for many leaders who have only led in person. So tell us more about this. How do we avoid this so it doesn't create anxiety within teams?
Yeah, so the precursor to this was geographic bias. So if you have lived in a rural part of the world and you wanted to apply for a job in a major city, for example, where you knew a company was headquartered, you might delete your address from the resume during the application process, just so you weren't geographically biased from the jump by seeing an address that isn't already aligned with where a company has their epicenter of power. So proximity bias is another level on top of that. And it really boils down to a disconnect between expectations and communication. So if you see praise and promotion going to those who come into the office more frequently or have a literal closer relationship, physical relationship with someone else in power, this is where proximity bias shows up. And we'll talk about this a bit more in depth, but in an all remote setting, everyone is equalized, everyone is equidistant from each other. A lot of companies are going hybrid after the pandemic, and this is one of the things that they will have to actively work to combat, because humans are naturally fond of things that are close to them. And it's something that is wired into our DNA. So you have to actively combat it. So I'll give you one tip here that I think is really powerful. So at GitLab, we tie all of our promotions to our values. And any company can do this. So when you are recommending someone for a promotion, there should be a promotion document where the recommending manager has to write down how this person has exemplified the core values of the company. And what's cool about this is that is a location agnostic practice. You can have values exemplified from any seat in the world. It doesn't have to be in an office, it could be in a home office, a WeWork, an airline seat, a hotel conference room. It removes location from the equation. And so that's where I would start, is making explicit that promotion is about values and results and not about how close someone is to another person.
Yeah, that's super interesting. How do you expect that to evolve just over the future of work as we have hybrid offices, some folks are working fully remote, but I feel like it's going to be fluid, right? For a lot of companies. Yes, there's companies that have gone fully remote, but I also imagine there's companies that are trying, we at Modern Health are going to try this hybrid workforce coming this fall. And who knows, maybe that transitions to more in person or less in person, more of a remote. So how do you expect that to evolve over time? And are there new biases that you expect to, in addition to proximity bias, that you expect companies and teams to face in different challenges like this?
When I'm advising companies making the remote transition, I start with a list of things not to do, because there is a lot of things that you need to do well to make the remote transition. So sometimes it's less daunting to just look at, well, what do we not do? Let's make sure we don't make the big mistakes. And for this, it really starts with making sure that the executives stay as out of the office as possible. So for companies that want to reopen an office, I advise them to keep their executives out, or at least make sure that remote is their default and the office is not their default. And the reason here is it sends a very clear signal that the office is not the epicenter of power. It is simply another place that you go to work remotely. So that people don't choose to go into the office to rub shoulders with the right people. They choose to go into the office because it's a change of scenery. Maybe it's more amenable to working than whatever their current home situation is. Signals are very, very important in combating proximity bias. And a lot of leaders aren't really aware of, let's say, putting the shoe on the other foot or putting themselves in the position of someone who would be looking up to them. Really, really important to do that. And I know a lot of executives have great offices and they've helped choose where the office is. So they're anxious and eager to get back to it. But I say, take one for the team, stay remote by default, and make sure that when you show up in the office, it's a surprise. You don't want people optimizing their life for that, because then they start to optimize for the notions of proximity bias.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, because I think, one of the struggles with this hybrid approach that candidly, we're thinking about as well as we are going to try this hybrid approach this fall is we are setting the number of days that people come in the office. So 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and can get into a little bit our thought process there. But some of the companies are basically saying, we're going to have an office, but come and go as you please. And we thought about that approach, but one of our concerns was, well, then the people who are in the office every day, like right away, right now, there's people at a disadvantage. Maybe there's folks who can't get into the office for whatever reason. And so those are the folks that aren't coming in. And now you create, right, this proximity bias for those who are coming in because maybe they live closer to the office. And then all of a sudden it creates this unfair playing field for those who are at a disadvantage to coming in because you have this full flexibility. And so that was one of our concerns with that approach is, well, maybe the people who aren't coming in are working mothers or people who live farther away or are not able to afford, living, closer to downtown San Francisco and Bay Area. And so just kind of thinking through these different things, because I think there's, on one hand, there's benefits to having full flexibility. On the other hand, there's benefits to having structure, so you can try to create some level playing field and try to remove these biases. And ultimately, we landed on having structure so that there is no chance for, managers or execs, frankly, to say, well, these people are the people that we have full flexibility. If these people are coming to an office 3 days or 4 days or 5 days a week, and these people on my team never come in, right? So kind of creating some structure, but curious your thoughts on that for the companies who are having offices and allowing full flexibility for those to come in and go as they please. I think maybe it's just having a really open conversation about that and making sure that they're not having that bias, but curious your thoughts on having the approach where it really is total flexibility.
Yeah, I appreciate the transparency there. So I'd offer two responses to that. One, I doubt there's a one size fits all. There are different company sizes. There's different levels of existing remote fluency and the comfortability with remote. Different industries are going to approach this different seasons of the company's life cycle. You name it, it's going to impact how a company looks at this. So because of that, it's difficult because there's really not a right answer for every company. So the second part of that is embrace iteration and treat this as a pilot project. A lot of companies right now are adding additional stress and anxiety on an already stressful situation by trying to get remote 100% right from day one without really having a view into what the future looks like. But a much healthier, more sustainable approach is to hire a head of remote or put someone in charge of this transition and map out a 1 to 2 year plan with quarterly milestones on what two-way doors are we going to walk through and learn from. If we don't like what we find on the other side of that door, we walk it back. There's nothing wrong with starting with a plan to come in 2 or 3 days and see how it goes for a quarter. Poll people, look at the data. How often do people come in? Is this having a positive or a negative impact on overall morale and productivity and career advancement? And then adjust accordingly. We've never done this before. This type of sea change in the workplace has never happened before. And so if you were not already structured one way or the other, fully co-located or fully remote, this is new territory. And the companies, the most progressive companies, I think will tell that to their employees and say, look, this is a journey and we hope you're on board with us and we're going to iterate and learn as we go.
Yeah, I like that. Thanks for sharing. So moving into some other topics, I'm curious to hear how does GitLab normalize mental health in the workplace? I think mental health plays a huge role, especially with this future of work as people are thinking about how to best support their employees. And we now know that, mental health is critical to having a successful, healthy, and happy workforce that ultimately can be a successful business. Curious how you guys think about that at GitLab. Of course, GitLab has recently extended access to Modern Health for employees through 2023, and we've seen over 30% engagement across all of GitLab's workforce all around the world, which is awesome. So we're seeing, really, really great engagement as we work and partner with your benefits team. But just curious, how do you think about mental health as you're thinking about the future of work and as you think about a remote workforce and how it ultimately can support their mental health as well?
So I'll start with this. Mental health is health, just like remote work is work. So these additional adjectives that we put on the front end of words like health and work, I think they're useful for now, but soon we won't need to reiterate that. It will almost be like adding tele on the front of phone. We get it, it's a phone. So first off, mental health is health, and it is just as important as any other element of health. And so you mentioned we've recently extended our partnership, and we've added therapy on top of coaching. And so it really starts with taking a look at what can we do to support our workforce. And I would say ask your workforce, because not every workforce will need the same thing. And as your people get more globally distributed, depending on cultures and expectations and norms, they may ask for different things in different regions of the world. So don't assume there that a one-size-fits-all approach is applicable as well. Really, this comes down to talking to your people and being realistic about the expectations and making sure that one thing doesn't override another. Companies can't say that mental health is important, but then set expectations that don't allow people the space to actually care for their mental health. And I know that sounds 101, very basic and foundational, but it is worth reminding folks, especially coming out of a pandemic. What we've seen globally is that the pandemic has squeezed out what I call life's buffer times. These are things like, in a pre-pandemic world, if you traveled every couple of weeks, you would have time in your day to pack, and there would be a commute to the airport, and there would be time spent in airport security. And then there's some time getting a meal at the airport. It is very unlikely that you would be doing work during this time. And those kind of ebbs and flows of real life give your mind a minute to reset and process and do things that matter to you, even if it was subconscious. Well, COVID largely squeezed all of that out, and what filled it was more work. So now, coming out of the pandemic, we have to be cognizant that people will start having that buffer time re-enter their life. But it's based on now a new baseline of working a heightened amount. And I do think that if leaders don't acknowledge and address this, this will spark a looming mental health crisis. And we're already seeing it across media reports that systemic burnout is happening. And so the data is there, and it's on leaders to really give voice to it, acknowledge it, and force the space back into people's lives so that this can be prioritized.
Yeah, that's totally agree with the points you made. I'm curious your thoughts on the human connection aspect of mental health. You know, with more and more companies switching to fully remote, I'm curious what you guys do at GitLab. Do you see value in bringing humans together? I think, you know, naturally humans crave that authentic interaction, right? Where we get to spend time together and, you know, meet each other and learn about each other's personal lives. And sometimes that's hard to do right over Zoom. So curious your thoughts on balancing those needs, like the desire as humans to crave that interaction. Do you guys do any sort of offsites where you bring people together physically, or, you know, what's your overall just approach and thought on that?
I appreciate you asking that, because I oftentimes take this for granted and fail to remember, I should say, that some people will look at GitLab and say, well, is the goal to just design a company where people never see each other in person? Absolutely not. So GitLab has one of the most robust in-person strategies of any company that I've ever seen. As you pointed out, humans are relational, communal beings, and there is no replacing selective, intentional in-person moments. What COVID has shown us is that we don't necessarily need to see our colleagues every single day in the office, but we probably should see them sometimes. And so at GitLab, we get the whole company together once a year for an amazing summit called GitLab Contribute. It's something that everyone looks forward to. Whenever a new hire joins the company, we give them the IOU whenever the next date is. It's a promise that we will invest in you, and you can travel to meet your colleagues. So yes, it matters. I think every company would approach this differently. For companies that are unwinding all of their office space, I'm advising to use some of that recaptured savings to give to senior leaders, and maybe every quarter or every half year, they get their sub teams together and you pick a point on a map and you develop this offsite or onsite, depending on your perspective, but get people together. And the core thing about getting people together after COVID is that you start to realize the highest ROI in getting people together is for culture building and rapport building, not really for work. Now, I'm not opposed to having some strategy sessions mixed in there, but make sure that when you spend the money to get people together, mostly just leave it open for people to bond and hang out and do excursions together and toast together, human things together. And in the meantime, allow them to live where they are most fulfilled. I see that as the best of both worlds. It gives ultimate optionality for people to choose their home and their community so that there's very rich home life that then pours back into work. But as a workplace, make sure that you invest in bringing people together, because we all have social reservoirs, and it's really, really important for the the employer, to make sure that there are moments where those reservoirs can be refilled from time to time.
That's so interesting. So while you guys are a remote first company, you still value the in-person connection and make huge investments there, it sounds like. So that's really interesting to hear about, because I think people probably think of GitLab and they're like, oh, it's a remote company, everything's remote, but there is still a human component and an in-person component to the business as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. And when you see people operating and thriving in 65 different countries in the world, it only makes you want to see them more, because you realize there are so many people who aren't like you, and you just can't wait to meet this person and find out what it's like to live in their corner of the globe. So absolutely, give voice to that, give investment to that. It's really critical from a company culture standpoint.
So interesting. So I've heard you share that inclusion isn't just about culture. It's also about workflows and how you approach meetings. Can you share a little more with the folks on the call about that?
Yeah, so I would say check out the remote work report by GitLab. You can search for that and you can drop a link here in the chat. We've done this 2 years running. And for 2021, one of the really interesting data points to come out of this was data supporting the link between transparency and visibility of work in the workplace and the feeling or sense of belonging from team members. So a lot of culture leaders look to things like Zoom virtual happy hours or on-sites or off-sites to increase this sense of belonging. And that is certainly a respectable approach. But what we have found is that the more transparent and visible you are in the work across the organization, people just naturally feel closer to the team. So here's what this looks like in practice. If you have OKRs and goals, for example, in a software platform, at GitLab, we use GitLab, the platform, to stand up all of our quarterly goals and objectives. Make them transparent to the entire organization so that the people in marketing can see the goals and objectives for the legal department, the engineering department, the design department, so on and so forth. Because even if their day-to-day work doesn't touch those areas, it just feels good to be able to see what other people are working on. And especially in a remote setting, when you might not get to see people in person for 6 or 12 months at a time, just knowing what drives them, knowing what they're working on, knowing what their day-to-day looks like, it's easier to feel like part of a team. And in co-located organizations, a lot of companies are structured on a need-to-know basis. You have to unwind that and actually do the opposite of that, be more visible, be more transparent. And by doing that, people will feel like a tighter knit community. So that is one additional element on the workplace side that leaders can look at to increase the sense of belonging.
Super helpful. Yeah, really, really helpful points. Kind of switching back to just how people are transitioning back to work right now, and that a lot of things are, candidly up in the air for companies on just trying to figure out the best approach. And on one hand, they want to come up with their plan and put that in place. And on the other, they want to stay, flexible and nimble. Do you think that there's any, potential challenges with iterating too quickly? What cadence should employers be thinking about how to evaluate, is their plan working? So let's say if someone's going with fully remote or hybrid or full, more in the office centric. How should they evaluate whether or not their plan is working? How quickly should they iterate on those plans? Should they check in with their employees once a quarter? Should they do surveys? Like, what are some tools and tips that you can share with the folks on the call on how they can evaluate, is their plan working or not?
Yeah, so I'll plug another asset that we have, which is the remote playbook. If you go to allremote.info, you'll see a download link right at the top. This is years of GitLab's proven principles put into a guide that you can actually digest over the weekend. And a lot of companies are using this as their blueprint to wrap their heads around what does a transition look like from a company that has already done this. So I'll start there. The second thing I want to mention here is any of your planning should focus less on where people physically are and more on how the work gets done. So the global narrative right now on the workplace is all about return to office or return to work, as if we haven't all been working through the pandemic. But the problem with that is,
it's a really good point. Yeah, they're like,
we
return to work. Are we not working? Yeah,
we're all working. We've been working. So return to work is a bit of a slap in the face to everyone who has been working suboptimal scenarios for the past year and a half. So a bit of levity there. But more seriously, the focus there is on where are your people, which masks the real question of how are your people working? So I would start by measuring the workflows. Audit all of your workflows and ask yourself, can this be done outside of the office, or does it require the office as a crutch? And that's a red flag on, is this really optimized for a virtual world, for a remote first world? Because ideally you want to convert all of your workflows to remote first so that they can work in the office, but they also work outside of the office. This fundamentally de-risks your business. So if another crisis happens or you have a large contingent of your workforce delocate or relocate and now they're not in the office, you don't want all of your workflows to fall apart. So that's where I would start, and then measure that. Measure the effectiveness of the transformation. So if you have to implement a new tool, like an OKR tool to get people aligned, Measure the effectiveness of that. What's the engagement? Are people using it? I actually recommend looking at recurring meetings. If you have a systemic meeting problem and everyone is complaining about Zoom fatigue, set a quarterly milestone to reduce your recurring meetings by 10% every single quarter. And measure that. Are you actively changing how you work such that you can accomplish the goal of putting more time back on people's calendars? These are the metrics that move the needle. So that's going to look different from company to company, but just a couple of examples of where to start.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And I like that you shared it's interesting, right? The return to work. Well, we've all been working and everyone's been working actually very, very hard. And the unforeseen circumstances, which hasn't been the most conducive for everyone's lives. So
yeah, and
yeah.
I'll also say, if I may, language is very, very important, as we're just talking about here. And we just hosted an event remote by GitLab, and we had an amazing panel on Twitter. Twitter's been one of the most public and vocal companies in transitioning their own workforce. And they are being very careful to not refer to reopening or returning to office. Sorry, they're saying we're reopening the office, because the only thing that's changing is that the doors are going from locked to unlocked.
Right.
It's not like you have to go back there to do the work that you've already been doing. And so that slight twist on language makes a big, big difference. And we're talking about mental health. The way that words strike people matter a lot in how things are perceived. A lot of companies come to me for advice on what does a head of remote look like, or how do I hire someone to lead this transition? What's the one can't miss skill? And the can't miss skill is storytelling. And a lot of people are like, what? What does that have to do with change management? This is all about storytelling. You have to get people on board to understand this massive cultural shift internally, to explain the why, to paint the picture of how their life can be different when travel restrictions are lifted. It's a key piece of getting buy-in and reducing dysfunction and chaos and confusion. And so for leaders out there, don't overlook the importance of language when you're going through this transition. It really, really matters.
Really, really good call out. Yeah, it's a really good point. So GitLab applies a manager of one principle to prioritizing rest and taking time off. Curious, for those who aren't familiar with this concept, how can they begin to embrace it? And yeah, what more can you share about this principle?
So good news, like everything else at GitLab, this is also documented. So some context, GitLab's entire company handbook is public to the world. It would be over 10,000 pages if you printed it out. Trust me, we don't ask people to read it all when they onboard. We just teach people how to search it. As if you can use Google.
It's so awesome. It's awesome that it's public, by the way. It's so awesome that, you guys are so transparent about sharing your approaches and sharing the learnings. Anyways, sorry to
yeah, no, thank you for that. And I want to reiterate that, because if you're listening to this, you can just go find how we do it. And you might not want to do it exactly the same way, but it's all there. The actual operating principles are there, and you're welcome to copy as much of it as you want. And we actually have an Inspired by GitLab page where we keep a running list of companies who will publicly say that we have inspired how they have transitioned their company. So if you want to be on that list, reach out and let me know. So this manager of one principle is documented, and there are 15 or 17 different core elements of it. But at a very high level, it means that everyone is empowered to be the manager of their own time and attention. Everyone in the company. This includes interns all the way up to the chief executives. And we put this in place because managers, as in people managers, is one thing, but giving people the autonomy and the mastery of their own time and attention is incredibly empowering, especially from a mental health standpoint. If you walk into an organization that says, we trust you to be a manager of one, we trust you to monitor your own time and attention. If you aren't needed on a call, you can opt out of it, or it's okay to look away. It's totally fine to take a break from video and go take your dog for a walk. You're the manager of your own time and attention. You're also the manager of your own well-being. So if you are stuck on a project where you can feel your anxiety levels rising up, it is totally okay to just put a stop sign on your Slack message and go do what you need to do. And you don't have to explain it or justify it. You are a manager of one. And this kind of goes back to our first question of psychological safety. When you empower everyone to do that, it enables a greater sense of psychological safety, but it also gives people the permission, if you will, to reach out to their people manager or executives and senior leaders in the company if they detect that there's an issue, but they aren't quite sure how to solve it. The manager of one is someone who asks for help when they need it. And so that's the principle, and it's been one of the most empowering and liberating parts of working here. And we see a lot of other companies embracing elements of that. And it's not a remote only type of principle. I would argue that this principle would be just as useful in a co-located space or a hybrid space.
Yeah, totally agree. This makes me think about one of our values, which is people first. And that includes, of course, our end users, our members, but also our own people, right? Putting themselves first. And the analogy we often give is it's like on an airplane when they tell you to put your face mask on first before you put it on the person next to you. And really I mean, of course, this is, core to Modern Health's mission. It's why we started the company in the first place, and what we're working on with the employers that partner with us. But people have to take care of themselves in order to then do great work and take care of the end user, and ultimately that translates into a successful business. So when you're just thinking about how do we ultimately get to a successful business, it starts with people taking care of themselves. Then they can do their best work, and then ultimately they can take care of everything else that they need to get done, and ultimately create an amazing product and service. And so I think it very much aligns with your concept of manager of one, which is, put your own face mask on first, do what you need to do to take care of yourself, prioritize your health, your physical health, your mental health, whatever it is you need to feel, on top of your game. And we often give the analogy, it's almost like we as professionals in this day and age are like professional athletes, but just in the working world. And just like professional athletes need to sleep well, eat well, take care of themselves, train, rest, we have to do all those things as well. And maybe they look a little bit differently. Of course, yes, eating well and getting some exercise and resting and sleeping well is important. And also for some people, it's spending time with family, taking time to turn off work, turn off their notifications, actually not check their phone or have technology interfere with their personal lives or time with family and loved ones. And so I think really it is about folks figuring out what works well for them and making sure that they have the space to prioritize it, and they have the type of supportive environment that lets them prioritize it, knowing that in the long run, that will translate into a much more successful business anyways.
Yeah, I have a great friend, John Fitch. He's the author of a book called Time Off. I would highly recommend it. And he likes to say that time off is for pros, just like athletes have to have an off season if they expect to perform well the next season. Knowledge workers, we are creative athletes. We might not be sports athletes, but we are still athletes, and time off is for pros. And another principle that he shares that I absolutely love is that rest and time off, whatever that looks like for you, is not in competition with work. It literally supports better work. And think of it from the concept of inhaling and exhaling. If you only inhale or you only exhale for an extended period of time, you will have significant challenges in just making it to the next day. And so the same principle is true in the workplace. If you try to grind through something without the yin and the yang, the inhale and the exhale, at some point it becomes so significantly out of balance that it is actually defeating the very purpose that you're going for. And this seems so obvious to say, but we have to remember and remind ourselves as humans, we are the only mammal on Earth that can override our innate need to sleep. Every other animal on the planet, when they're tired, they sleep. But human beings, we can push through that and we can override that. And we have to remember that that is an interesting part of what makes us who we are, but it's good to give voice to that and remember that things like time and rest are very important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Somewhat of a good segue into, the concept of a nonlinear workday, and ultimately how that can support folks to put their own face mask on first and then make sure they're still getting their work done. But it doesn't necessarily need to be around this whole concept of a 9 to 5. How does this approach benefit well-being or health overall? I'm curious how you guys approach this within GitLab.
Yeah, so the nonlinear workday is a fascinating concept. In the book that you mentioned, Living the Remote Dream, had an entire chapter devoted to this. And not all roles are amenable to this. So if you are a surgeon on a certain shift, you're expected to be in the operating room from a certain time to a certain time. You won't be able to enjoy the benefits of a nonlinear workday. But for many knowledge workers, you can start to break down, when am I most productive? And the answer might be something different than 9 to 5. And in fact, it might be stop and start, where you work from 8 to 10, and then from 10 to 12, you go spend time with your family, you take your kiddo for a quick hike, something to break up the day. And then you join for another 4 or 5 hours, and then you take another extended break. And then you actually tack a couple of hours on late into the night when everyone else is asleep. Now, this might seem crazy from a conventional co-located office environment to come and go from the office that many times, but in a remote setting, this is totally feasible and totally practical. And a lot of people who have worked in a co-located space don't know when their peak productivity hours are, because they've never worked in a place that gave them the opportunity to find out the answer. So for those who have transitioned to remote and you're still working the exact same rigid schedule, challenge that notion. Start experimenting with doing things a little bit differently, breaking up your day. If there's something that matters to you, try to weave it into your day and normalize that you're coming and going out of the office. And it is not a sign that you are not engaged with your work. It is a sign that you are being a manager of one, that you are so in tune with your body that you are optimizing your day literally by the hour for mental health as well as productivity to the workplace. Share what you do. This is a radical concept for a lot of people, and they need to see other people do it just to try this out for themselves. And so that's the most extreme example. If you think, where do I even start with this? If you're used to having an hour-long commute in the morning and an hour-long commute in the evening, block those times that you used to spend commuting in your calendar and deliberately replace it with something that's life-giving, whether that's volunteering at a local food bank, whether that's reading, whether that's extending your education, whether that's calling a parent or a friend or a sibling, whether it's just resting, whether it's binging Netflix, anything that is not work, make sure it's there in that block. Assign 17 reminders to it so that you can't just override it. It matters. You need to be able to ramp into your day and ramp out of your day. I've heard a lot of people say, like, I missed my commute. It gave me a chance to listen to my podcast. Like, I hear you, but let's not force everyone to go back into rush hour traffic just so you have podcast time. You can make the podcast time, but you have to be intentional about slotting that into your day.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and it makes me think of, normalizing boundary setting. And we actually at Modern Health have boundary badges where people will give each other badges for setting boundaries. And I think it could be as simple as, hey, no, I can't take a meeting at 6 p.m. I've got cooking dinner and having a family dinner with my kids, or putting my kids to bed, and this is the time I get to spend with them. But curious if you have any other tips on how, for those who are listening, how we can normalize boundary setting.
Yeah, this is another thing that's extremely difficult to do bottoms up. So if it is empowered from the very top, like if you see your executives doing this, it becomes very easy to normalize all the way down. This is very, very difficult from bottoms up. But if you are in that situation, bring it up to your leadership, bring it up in manager one-on-ones that boundary setting matters to you. It is likely that it matters to the person you're telling it to, and it can create this wave of momentum that helps spur change in the organization. I will give you one small tip on how GitLab leverages technology to make boundary setting a more prominent part of our culture. So we use PTO by Root. It is a Slack bot that tracks our PTO. And at the beginning of every month, people can opt into this direct message from the program, and it pings them in Slack and it says, hey, believe it or not, it's the first working day of a new month. Have you considered what time you're taking off this month? If not, now is a great time to do it. And if you feel like you can't take time off this month, copy and paste this message into your next one-on-one document so that it becomes something that is vocalized with your manager. So we literally use technology to give people permission to bring this up in the workplace, because not everyone is comfortable saying that. People get into a grind and they think, oh, I can't take time off, and I can't even mention that I need time off. Take that burden away from people. If you can leverage technology to make that a part of the general conversation, do it.
Super, super helpful. Yeah, totally agree. And I think even just, how culture has shifted where we can normalize blocking things on our calendar, right? And being open about everything from, hey, I've got on my calendar when I see my therapist or a couples therapist or my executive coach, and just being open and honest about those things. And I totally agree that this is something that has to come from the top down, right? We have to, as leaders, embody these things and set the example so that people do feel comfortable blocking their calendar and prioritizing the things in their life that are important to them, that ultimately, again, translate in them doing even better work.
Yeah, indeed. And there should be no stigma around it, because what it's actually doing is being a manager of one. So if you have a therapy session and you don't block it on your calendar, then everyone else will just assume that they can put work in that space because you didn't be honest with people that it was already spoken for. And so there should be no stigma around it. This is truly being a better manager of your own time, as well as the expectations of folks around you. So normalizing that is big, but also take the initiative to put that on the calendar, and that tends to spur action. People follow as they're led. So if you're in a position of leadership, start doing that.
So this has been so helpful, Darren. Thank you so much for helping to walk through the answers to each of these questions. I think we'll pass it to starting to tackle some of the questions that some of the participants have added to the chat. And one of them, Sherry just shared, that I thought was really interesting, is how do we transition away from an hours mindset in addition to the non-linear day, which is people assume, okay, we work 40 hours a week. What if someone can be just as impactful in 30 hours or less? And I think what comes up for me is really, as a leader at a company, thinking about it more based on output versus number of hours, right? What are we tracking towards? What are our goals? Setting very clear goals. We use OKRs and KPIs to track progress and output versus number of hours. Because at the end of the day, the hours, candidly shouldn't really matter. What should just matter is what's the output? How are things going? How is the business doing? But curious how you guys think about this at GitLab as well.
We very much align with that. GitLab has 6 core values, and they are arranged in a hierarchy, and results is the #1 value. But if you look under that, we explicitly say that results are based on outputs, not inputs, not hours spent. And this is something that will become, I think it will become more normalized in conversation, because remote forces you to really acknowledge just how silly it was to just ask people to work a certain amount of hours, instead of actually saying, what are the business results that we hope you drive by joining our company? And so what this will trigger is a reevaluation from leaders on managing their direct reports. You can no longer manage by how many hours did they work, or am I impressed by the clothes that they wear? You really have to define, what does success look like? And there's some interesting research by Slack's Future Forum that say that this remote transition is having the biggest impact on middle managers. They're feeling the brunt of this. And one of the core reasons is middle managers essentially have to re-audit how they measure and praise and promote all of their directs. And they have to get super clear and explicit on what does success look like. And if you can write that down, you can share that with anyone at any point in the world, in any time zone in the world, and it really empowers and enables a remote atmosphere. But if you can't answer that question, what does success look like? The hours are irrelevant. So I would really start there. At GitLab, we're all about boring solutions. So I would start there. Can you look at your direct and answer, what does success look like? And then if you can answer that, you can start to dig a bit deeper and say, well, is this practical or feasible to be done in 30 or 40 hours a week? Or is this going to require 60 hours a week? Because if so, that's the red flag you want. Maybe we should retool the expectations. Maybe we should rearrange the team, redistribute the work. Maybe we should look into new tooling, or look into upskilling and learning and development to give people new skills to do things more efficiently and effectively. It does invite a lot of questions. I'm not saying it's not more work, but it's worthwhile work, and it puts people in a better spot as an employee of your company.
Super, super helpful. Thanks for sharing that. Couldn't agree more. There was one other question around, Sherry shared, without having read the GitLab handbook with the manager of one concept, which I love, what is the main role of the manager? The coach to support an ability to be manager of one, orchestration beyond each individual employee. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Great question, Sherry. Thank you for that. So the core goal of a manager in a remote setting, when you have everyone as a manager of one, is to be an unblocker, not a director. So a lot of people use the word coach, but I really like unblocker because I feel like it is more explicit. So in co-located roles, it's really easy to be a micromanager or a director where you're always on the offensive telling people what to do. And so for task-oriented people, this can work really well. But in a remote setting, you don't really know where anyone is on a given day. You don't know what time zone they're working. Maybe they have a non-linear workday. So as a manager, you essentially have to wake up every day and put a proverbial catcher's mitt on and just be ready to accept feedback into that glove, ready to accept blockers from your people. And this goes all the way back to the start of this conversation on creating a psychologically safe atmosphere. If you do that, your directs will feel comfortable surfacing challenges early and often to you, so you can catch them and unblock them when they're small, hopefully. So your goal really should be to catch those and unblock your people and let them run as fast as you can. If you've not read the book High Output Management, I would very much recommend looking into that. And if you just want to get down to this one principle, look up Managerial Leverage. There's a lot of summaries of this portion of the book on managerial leverage, where it says unblockers are there to create leverage amongst their team. It is not about the work that the manager accomplishes, it is about the amount of work that they enable their team to do. So this is the notion of creating leverage. And the best way to create leverage is to get blockers out of people's way. And the only way you're going to be able to unblock people is if you create a psychologically safe atmosphere so they feel comfortable coming to you with those blockers, and then your wisdom, experience, and connections in the organization help unblock them.
Love that. Thanks for sharing. So we'll have one more question before we close out, which is peek into the future and share how you think mental health will play a role in tomorrow's workplace. Curious your initial thoughts on that.
Thankfully, I think it will become a critical part of how candidates evaluate where they want to work. Again, mental health is health. And one thing that the pandemic has made clear to everyone is that health matters. We may have deprioritized it in the past. I think two things, health and community. We may have deprioritized those and said, oh, I'll get to health later on in life, or I'll get to community later on in life. And the pandemic has made us realize they are life. That is really all that we're living for. And I do expect it to come up earlier in candidate conversations, same as workplace flexibility. It has greatly democratized the conversation on remote work. I see candidates going into job interviews now, and on the very first call, they say, what is your stance on workplace flexibility? And they truly expect organizations to have an answer to that. And then the next question is going to be, what do you do to support your people from a mental health standpoint and a health standpoint? It's going to be critical, because if you look at the hierarchy of needs, those things have to be satisfied before any of the work ever begins to matter. And we've reached a place now where people feel empowered and democratized to ask those questions. And so if you're listening to this and you're saying, yes, absolutely, be the change we want to see, ask those questions, bring it up at work, challenge your leaders, challenge your directs to make sure that it's a constant part of the conversation, and weave people objectives and health objectives into your OKRs. Metrics matter, revenue matters, but the quality of your health and your team matters as well, because after all, they are the people driving those results.
Couldn't agree more. And this is something we're seeing firsthand at Modern Health. Mental health has really become that fourth pillar of benefits, right? You've got medical, dental, and vision, and we know mental health is just as important. And so we're seeing it as table stakes for employers. And I love what you said, be the change that you want to see. I think everyone on this call, all of us, we have a huge opportunity to rewrite what it means for people to show up at work. What is the future of work? How can we create an inclusive and healthy and supportive work environment while also having a very successful business that thrives, where people thrive and business thrives, and we don't have to sacrifice one or the other. It can be done, and all of us on this call can play a huge role in that. So I really, really loved, that you shared that, and ending on that note for everyone to be the change that they want to see, because we all can play a role in that. Well, Darren, thank you so much. This has been incredibly, incredibly helpful. Really great insights. I'm sure everyone that has participated on this call has taken some great nuggets away as they're thinking about the future of work and how they can best support their employees. So thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants who have joined us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alyson. Thanks all for joining.
Thanks everyone for joining. We'll be following up with some awesome resources for you that I listed here. and we'll end up 5 minutes early, so you can take a break.
Yeah, go get outside, take a break, and support your mental health and take care of yourselves. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks all.
Take care.